It's a pleasure to rise to speak on the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill this evening. The current changes to this legislation, the legislation has been enforced since 1986, and since that time we now find that 1/3 of New Zealand households now live in rental accommodation. And indeed, private rental housing is having a bigger impact on New Zealand's social and economic outcomes than it did in 1986 when the current Act entered into force. Mr Speaker, I have an appreciation of both sides of this debate. Last weekend I was a tenant, but with my family moved into home ownership. And I'm reliably informed my wife is at home at the moment unpacking boxes, at least in as far as the program Desperate Housewives is no longer on. She would be unpacking them. So, Mr Speaker, what I can say to you is that I do appreciate the need to balance. I know the members opposite interjecting, and if Hansard would have a look and note them down, I know that they actually tune in their offices to Desperate Housewives most nights of the week. Mr Speaker, I therefore have an appreciation of the challenges that tenants face, the uncertainty there can be if you have an unscrupulous landlord, but at the same time believe that those who own properties view them in many cases not as a business but as their own homes, and they too have rights as well as obligations. Mr Speaker, therefore, the reforms that this bill brings to the House tonight are long overdue, and I believe the committee worked very well in this. We sought to balance the rights and obligations of the tenant with the rights and obligations of the landlord. I'd like to thank the very, very hard-working Minister Phil Heatley for the work that he's done in this term of Parliament in bringing this bill to the stage that it is. But I also want to recognise that it was the previous government that introduced this legislation first to the House, and that it's to be completed in this term of Parliament. Indeed, Mr Speaker, to my colleagues on this side of the House and members opposite, I believe that the committee worked very well together. We did share concern in most areas that have been raised in the debate so far, and certainly the concerns that many submitters had, and particularly tenants and their advocates. And I think where we differed sometimes was only the approach by which we would fix some of these issues and concerns, but generally the committee worked very well together, and we had a lot of very good submissions that I think all members learnt from. Now, the bill does a number of things, and I want to touch on them just briefly and then go into one area in a little more detail. This extends the coverage of the Act quite substantially, clarifies a number of issues that submitters were concerned with, and particularly the responsibility of outgoing, such as rates and water, exactly who should be responsible for those and in what conditions their responsibility should be met. It also provides for new processes for terminating or renewing tenancy agreements. Is very important because, as I think the last speaker opposite said, when somebody lives in a home, whether they own it or not, they want a certain amount of security. So the bill before us goes a long way to provide that security for tenants. It encourages landlords and tenants to comply more fully with their obligations, and provides for the majority of tenancy disputes to be resolved more quickly, fairly and cost-effectively. And I think this is important, again, for tenants but also for landlords. Mr Speaker, it improves the enforceability of tenancy tribunal orders and enables steps to be taken in the case of unclaimed or uncollected bonds and for them to be refunded. Now, Mr Speaker, it also deals with the issue of abandoned goods, and we received a number of submissions both from landlords and tenants on this issue. The law as it stands at the moment means that if a tenant leaves a property and leaves goods behind, depending upon the value of those goods, it's up to the landlord. The landlord has an obligation to store them at his own cost, and in some cases for an extended period of time. Now, we realise in committee we need to be very careful that in not all cases goods are abandoned, but the current law doesn't distinguish between those that are left and are to be collected and those that are merely abandoned when a tenant leaves under whatever circumstance. So what we did in committee, Mr Speaker, and certainly what this bill does now, is allows it continues the obligation upon landlords to act responsibly, but reduces some of the burden upon them in the extended periods of time where they might not just need to store those goods, and indeed means that the storage of those goods would not always be at their cost. I think it's a more balanced approach, which means landlords will need to act more responsibly, however, again, not at their full cost. I want to mention one submitter, Mr Speaker, Richard Evans of Rotorua Rentals. He submitted and appeared before the committee. Mr Evans travelled to Wellington to provide information to us. Now, Rotorua Rentals manages 800 properties in Rotorua, an extremely professional company, and the experience that Mr Evans brought to the committee, I believe, was extremely useful. Mr Speaker, it just leaves me to thank the committee staff for their work, the officials, the experts from the ministry, but all submitters to this bill. It made it easier for the whole committee, I believe, to get to a position where the legislation that is before us now will do a great deal of good, will provide greater protection to tenants, but most importantly also provide greater certainty to landlords and homeowners. I commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
I call Rajin Prasad.